welcome all of you. And thank you very much for coming out on a day like this. Now, I should suppose that in Ithaca, I shouldn't have to say that. But it's our first of the year, seriously speaking. And if we needed any reminder about our city, here we have it. So welcome, everybody. Our benefactors, Reuben Monday and his wife, Dr. Cheryl Castleberry Monday, they are in the air right now because of all the weather problems, so they'll be joining us later, definitely before this lecture is over. But we're going to start. We do have a speaker here, and I hope that maybe before question time, we'll have the opportunity of properly introducing them. 2014 was when Reuben A. Monday 69, MPS 74, and Cheryl Castleberry Monday 72 gave us the endowment to create this lecture and support it. Over the years that the lecture has held, it has brought on each occasion a leading scholar of African and African American studies or otherwise distinguished African American to the Ithaca campus. That otherwise is very important because one year we did have a journalist, a very distinguished one, so for an event that is open to the public, I hope and I look forward to having the privilege of thanking them again, when they do show up here. This has been very important to the growth of what we do in Africana, to the enhancement of why we exist, and to the education of the students who walk through our portals to be educated by us. And for that, we cannot thank them enough. We do hope that other people do the same. It's never too much. And my work here today is very limited to doing what I'm doing right now, and more importantly, to invite my colleague who is going to introduce our speaker. And in calling on Professor Rachel Richardson to do the introduction, I also want to share with you how grateful I am to her because she accepted this at the very last minute. And it is a sign of her good citizenship to the department. This is not the only time that I've dropped stuff like this on her and she said yes. So I really want to publicly acknowledge that and thank her for that. Professor Richardson, please.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
It is a pleasure to be here today, and I extend another hearty welcome to everyone here at the Reuben A. and Cheryl Castleberry Monday Annual Lecture in the Africana Studies and Research Center. I also welcome and greet members of the audience from the Ithaca community, from the Cornell campus at large, and from the Africana Studies and Research Center. I welcome Professor James Turner, founding Africana Director, his wife, Dean Janice Turner, and former Africana Director, Professor Robert L. Harris, among distinguished guests and emeritus ASRC faculty. I am excited and deeply honored to welcome this year's Monday lecturer, the distinguished scholar Imani Perry, to the ASRC on Cornell's campus and to introduce her today. Her current visit to the Cornell community builds upon her rich and deeply impactful dialogues and presentations on this campus in the past. I am proud that Professor Perry and I share roots in the state of Alabama. She was born in Birmingham. She received her BA at Yale University, her PhD at Harvard University in American Civilization, and her JD from Harvard Law School. She is a beacon and a true thought leader in the field of African American studies and the array of other areas in which she works. She is currently the Hughes Rogers Professor of African American Studies and a faculty associate in the program in Law and Public Affairs, the University Center for Human Values, Gender and Sexuality Studies, and Jazz Studies at Princeton University. Professor Perry has written and taught on a number of topics regarding race and African American culture, areas in which she is a critical innovator and beacon. Using methods of discussion and analysis from various fields of study, including law, literary and cultural studies, music, and social sciences, Professor Perry's work often focuses on multifaceted issues such as the influence of race on law, literature, and music. She is the author of Prophets of the Hood, Politics and Poetics in Hip Hop, and has published numerous articles in the areas of law, cultural studies, and African American studies. In 2005, I remember being excited because Professor Perry and I were both among the guests featured on the UNC NPR radio show, The State of Things, on the same day. Her work was inspiring to see in this field as I developed my own project on the Dirty South rap music. In her work, Professor Perry has taken on complicated and timely issues. In her 2011 book, More Beautiful and More Terrible, The Embrace and Transcendence of Racial Inequality in the United States, for example, Perry discusses the ongoing intersection of race and politics in America. In addition to More Beautiful, More Terrible, and Prophets of the Hood, Professor Perry is the author of May We Forever Stand, A History of the Black National Anthem, a cultural history of the Black National Anthem, Lift Every Voice and Sing. Her biography of Lorraine Hansberry, Looking for Lorraine, The Radiant Life of Lorraine Hansberry, was published recently. She was among the interviewees in the recent landmark PBS documentary entitled Lorraine Hansberry, Sighted Eyes, Feeling Heart. Professor Perry has also recently published Bexy Thing on gender and liberation. She's done the phenomenal work of publishing 3 books this year alone, which have been generating very useful and important public discussions. Professor Perry has published numerous articles in the areas of law, cultural studies, and African American studies. She also wrote the notes and the introduction to the Barnes & Noble Classics edition of The Narrative of Sojourner Truth. Professor Perry writes book reviews for the New York Times and the San Francisco Chronicle. I cherish Imani Perry as a colleague in the profession, not only for her brilliant work and for her genuine genius, but also for the remarkable, kind, considerate, creative, and truly extraordinary person that she is. Please join me in extending a warm and hearty welcome to Professor Imani Perry.
It's a rare introduction that makes you cry. That was one. Thank you so much. I want to thank, though they're not here yet, I'm looking forward to having the opportunity to thank the Mundys and, of course, Africana Studies and Research Center. It's always wonderful to be here because it's one of these unique places where I always encounter friends, make new friends, and have really rich intellectual discussions. And actually, for my several of my my last book, the two talks that I gave before publication that were most generative for me were delivered here. So I'm expecting you all to help me after I speak a little bit. This is a particularly meaningful time for me to sort of reflect on Black studies broadly, right? So we are approaching 400 years since Jamestown, 1619. Not technically the point of the first arrival of Africans in the colonies, but when it's acknowledged. So, you know, we commemorate because that's the time we commemorate. It's often imprecise. And then sort of 50 years since the institutionalization of Black studies in U.S. higher education. Again, there's a longer history there, but since the formal institutionalization, so there's we're in a period, I think, that demands some reflection. And one of the things that is interesting to me is that a challenge in the field is that it entails an impulse to both write Black people into academic history as a kind of insurgent practice in the field of Black studies, but also as an institutionalizing one. And that's always a vexed terrain, right? Institutionalization always has its limitations. And in the process of struggling through this, we ask questions, you know, what history we will tell, with what kinds of purging and what kinds of commitments in service of a narrative or the claim to a particular category. For what types of institutions do we work, right? And how? Are we working for their maintenance, their improvement, or their destruction or revolution? I'm particularly committed over the body of work, and I work in multiple areas, but insofar as my work, whether or not it is apparent on the surface, is always in the field of Black studies, I'm committed to thinking of it as an endeavor that is quite distinct from simply the study of Black people in one region or another. That is to say, not everyone who studies Black people does Black studies, right? And in fact, for that very reason, when I hear the response to Africana, Black studies, African American studies, where people say, well, should we just integrate these into the other disciplines, right? My immediate answer is, well, yes, Black people should have places in those disciplines, right? The story of Black people, like those of everyone, merit a place in the official stories of nations of modernity, but Black studies is not the same thing as inclusion. It's not reducible to inclusion into the traditional disciplines, right? In part because one of the central priorities of Black studies has been the confrontation of the problem of the West and the world. It is a tradition of thought that includes disrobing, paradigm-shifting, double and triple critical consciousnesses in which one, as a scholar, must read history not merely as a timeline, but as a moving vortex for forces, ideas, conflicts, definition, connection, and rupture, not merely events in the lives of Black people, though that's included, right? And so that's a kind of frame for my work, and what I'm going to talk about today is in that tradition. And I talk from a project that I've just begun working on, but that I've also been working on since 1995, on jurisprudence in African American letters. And when I say since 1995, it's I'm taking up concerns that I took in my dissertation that are coming to the fore for me right now with a renewed sense of urgency. So why jurisprudence? One of the interesting things is that I think jurisprudential questions which have been really at the fore of African American literature and writing of various forms since its inception has been relatively muted in the recounting of that tradition. And then oftentimes it is obscured by the debates over particular paths to freedom, right? The kind of ideologies around path, whether integrationism or nationalism or Pan-Africanism or revolutionary socialism or black form of imperialism. We tell those stories, and they're important to tell. But what I am interested in exploring is that while the political economy and economic frame is fundamental to thinking through modernity and questions of race, racial capitalism, the American order, that the operation of justice or injustice as a series of procedures is an important structure of relation that is coterminous to but not reducible to an idea like capitalism, right? So we have to consider not just how it is, but how justice is done and how those who have had a position of being cast out, but also critically observing, show us about how, are critical of how it is done, how justice is executed. So I'm going to talk through several historic examples, classic texts, and then make an argument about how their jurisprudential claims are perhaps useful generally, but also for the present moment. Right? And I just want to say as a little caveat, there's a bit of a risk because I've been doing book talks about a lot of other stuff, and I'm sleep deprived, but I really didn't want to pass the opportunity to talk this through. Okay. So in 1964, during a roundtable in New York called The Black Revolution and the White Backlash, Lorraine Hansberry said the following in response to a protest in New York by CORE, which is a Stalin, which is essentially sort of standing in the street and preventing the movement of traffic as a way to protest racial injustice. And she said, I was in a bit of a stew over the Stalin, because when the Stalin was first announced, I said, oh my God, now everybody's gone crazy, tying up traffic, what's the matter with them, who needs it? And then I noticed the reaction starting in Washington and coming on up to New York among what we all are here calling the white liberal circles, which was something like, you Negroes act right or you're going to ruin everything we're trying to do. And that got me to thinking more seriously about the strategy and the tactic that the Stalin intended to accomplish. And so I sat down and wrote a letter to the New York Times about the fact that I am of a generation of Negroes that comes after a whole lot of other generations. And my father, for instance, who was, a real American-type American, successful businessman, very civic-minded and so forth, was the sort of American who put a great deal of money, a great deal of his really extraordinary talents, and a great deal of passion to everything that we say is the American way of going after goals. That is to say that he moved his family into a restricted area where no Negroes were supposed to live, and then proceeded to fight the case in the courts all the way to the Supreme Court of the United States, and this cost a great deal of money. It involved the assistance of NAACP attorneys and so on, and this is the way of struggling that everyone says is the proper way to do it. And it eventually resulted in a decision against restrictive covenants, which is very famous, Hansberry v. Lee, and that was very much applauded. But the problem is that Negroes are just as segregated in the city of Chicago now as they were then. And my father died a disillusioned exile in another country. That is the reality that I'm faced with when I get up and I read that some Negroes my own age and younger say that we must now lie down in the streets, tie up traffic, stop ambulances, do whatever we can, take to the hills if necessary with some guns and fight back. You see, this is the difference. Now, I've referenced this quotation in many ways recently as I've talked about Lorraine Hansberry, and to distinguish, one is to distinguish between Lorraine and her quite famous father politically, in order to reveal her political radicalism, to understand where she fit in the movement and the like. But another way is to think about Hansberry as standing in a tradition of African-American theories of justice that emerge in the particular framework of a settler colonialist Herrenvolk democracy, economically built upon the wealth of the transatlantic slave trade, and an empire proclaiming democracy, yet resting upon colonial dominion over other states with an internal structure of racial domination. So Hansberry saw that legal victory was not, in fact, the execution of justice, and that the deceptiveness of such victories could turn patriotism into bitterness, a man, like her father, a patriot into an expatriate, seeking an alternative juridical order in which to create his domicile. He had plans to move the family to Mexico and actually purchased a home in Mexico when he died from a brain aneurysm. And that critical stance led her to take a position of openness to the various forms of protest for freedom. Now, the uses of jurisprudence are akin to the uses of history. That is to say, my efforts to name a coherent set of thoughts and a tradition that we might call African-American jurisprudence or African-American literary jurisprudence to weave a narrative out of a myriad set of instances of observation is to say something about the problem of the U.S. in global history, this fantastic spectacle, this grand experiment, this site and agent of genocide, this empire of liberty, land of the free, and home of the slave. But there's also a question about the uses of jurisprudence in the history of Black thought, why it appears again and again. And I'd argue there's something being sought, explored, grappled with. That seeking is in part a consequence of being caught in the spokes of history, but it's also an imagining, a deep knowledge of the dangerous fictions that elicits intellectual interrogation. So what I'm working to unearth is much more than the statements, this is unjust, or the Augustinian, that which is unjust is not law, right? That does have a thread of tradition that's been taken up in African-American letters. Those do appear quite frequently in the literature, but instead it's looking to the tradition to ascertain the concept of justice, the concept of mercy, the problem of authority, the drive for social organization, ways of being in the midst of the American cancer of selfishness and greed. So I want to begin with the problem in the history of race in the United States, Federalist 54, written by James Madison. So it's the Federalist paper that takes up the question of how enslaved people ought to be counted in relation to taxation and representation, right? And the debate was, if representation were based on human population, then the slave states would have a number of seats in the House out of proportion to that size of its citizenry. So Southerners wanted the enslaved to count. Northerners did not, both vying for the political interest of their people in their region, and the 3/5 clause became the compromise. It makes a compelling portraiture of the white supremacist order that was inured in the nation's founding, 3/5 of a person. But in fact, that would be a gross overstatement of the degree of citizenship of the enslaved, right? It was not 60%, it was nil. Political compromise over the backs and bounty of those excluded was written into the founding of the nation, right? With their complete exclusion. Robert Ferguson, the author of the classic text Law and Letters, argued that lawyers in the early republic replaced ministers as the primary intellectual force in the society. Right? And so essays and poems and playwrights were written by lawyers in the early republic. It's good we kind of got past that. As a particular thread in the intellectual history of the United States, even before significant numbers of African Americans entered the law professionally, however, legal thinking was very early on a major intellectual force in Black letters. I saw a t-shirt online recently that resonated, albeit irreverently, with a piece of this tradition, and it read, maybe a bunch of white slaveholders from the 1700s did not come up with the best government ever. Now certainly that was speculated from the very beginning of African American letters, and the thinking has bearing for us to this day. And so the title of this talk, as you may have gathered, is a bit of a pun. Black letter law, as a term of art in the practice of law, refers to like basic standards or principles of law which are generally known and free of debate, is just accepted, right? By a majority of judges in most states, et cetera. For example, like things that are black letter might be things like, you know, the technical definition of assault. Now the pun is, of course, that at least in operation, a standard principle of American law, historically, part of its black letter, is that the mechanism of white supremacist thought courses through the entire landscape of legal interpretation and outcomes. Sometimes this happens when the letter of the law is applied distinctly based upon who stands before it, and sometimes it happens in the construction of the laws itself. Now, the first memoir actually to ever emerge from the White House was that of one of James Madison's slaves, okay, the author of the Federalist 54. And it's a short book. It's 30 pages long. It's mostly just basic information. But there's one moment counted in it in the midst of the War of 1812 that really is quite important. Madison is surprised to see that one of the officers who's coming to work with him has black men fighting with him. You know, so the British women, they promised emancipation for enslaved people, but the Americans generally didn't have them. And so James Madison asks, in a bit of a shocked, right, if the Negroes would run at the approach of the British, assuming, you know, that they would be too afraid to fight. And the man responded, "They do not know how to run." And this moment in the text is this brilliant subversion, right? Because it's not fear or incapacity that is the source of not knowing how to run, right? There's a suggestion of fugitivity there, but rather, it really is a focus on their bravery, right? So it becomes a kind of anticipatory exemplum of the Fannie Lou Hamer modification of the Star-Spangled Banner from land of the free, home of the brave to land of the free, home of the slave, right? Which operates not simply as an ironic commentary, a critique of the nation, but actually a doubling of the slave and brave here, right? If not synonymous, conjoined, right? Now, that's of course not what Francis Scott Key had in mind when he wrote the Star-Spangled Banner, right? The third verse reads as follows: "And where is that band who so vauntingly swore that the havoc of war and the battle's confusion, a home and a country should leave us no more? Their blood has washed out their foul footsteps' pollution. No refuge could save the hireling and slave from the terror of flight, running, or the gloom of the grave. And the Star-Spangled Banner in triumph doth wave o'er the land of the free and the home of the brave." Killing the enslaved who fought for the British exchange for their freedom, according to Francis Scott Key, having their blood on the field, the blood of these black men on the field, cleansed the nation of the stain of the British. The flag, he said, waved over the dead bodies of black people. So when David Walker makes a very different claim for liberty in his 1829 appeal, which sent shockwaves throughout the United States, right? That's important to note. A document smuggled in boats to people who were prohibited from literacy at the risk of death, right? The appeal argued, among other claims, that according to the principles of a higher law, the only potential redemption of the nation lay in the hands of the enslaved. Without another kind of citizen imagined, a black citizen brought from the dregs to the center, the settlement of the nation would be doomed to damnation. Now, Walker was a Christian. He set ablaze the assertion that the meek shall inherit the earth with a call for insurrection, of course influenced by the specter of the Haitian Revolution. Interestingly enough, this became another means of saying we do not know how to run, instead we must fight. Okay? Now when I mention this as a subversion, I mean it not so much in the literal sense, right, because runaways were important insurgents in enslaved society. What I mean is that it actually challenged the rendering of the runaway as a lawbreaker, as someone who has betrayed the rule, and instead renders a particular type of fugitivity as a form of patriotism, an essential patriotism, the only possible redemption. Also, just as an aside, what's interesting about the Madison quotation is that it happens at precisely the same time as James Madison is in conversation with Paul Cuffey about Liberia. And in some ways, I think it's sort of the beginning of what's later termed black custodial politics. Like, he wants Paul Cuffey, this black man, businessman, to like be, in charge of Liberia and the settlement, right? But doesn't believe in the potential of the black soldier to fight for freedom, which is an indication that he saw Cuffey as someone who would simply do the bidding of white Americans. But that's an aside. Another sort of classic exemplar of this concept is found in Frederick Douglass, a man who was in some ways, we understand, a father of African American literature and letters. And Douglass argued famously that constitutional principles had been betrayed in upholding slavery. So departing from fellow abolitionist William Lloyd Garrison, who said, the Constitution was a fundamentally flawed document because it protected slavery, Douglass instead decided, rather than abandoning the Constitution, he chose instead to read it as a source of potential. Right? Now, this sense of what the law might be and hope for it appears in Douglass's letters in many interesting ways, but I want to reference briefly one of the most famous moments in his narrative, the battle with the slave breaker Covey. This man he's been sent to because he's known for breaking the wills of headstrong enslaved people. Now, Douglass wrote, and this is the famous chiasmus of the text, "You have seen how a man was made a slave, you shall see how a slave was made a man." And this precedes his confrontation with the slave breaker who has been beating him regularly. And he says, "This battle with Mr. Covey was the turning point in my career as a slave. It rekindled the few expiring embers of freedom and revived within me a sense of my own manhood. It recalled the departed self-confidence and inspired me again with a determination to be free. The gratification afforded by the triumph was a full compensation for whatever else might follow, even death itself. He only can understand the deep satisfaction which I experienced, who has himself repelled by force the bloody arm of slavery. I felt as I had never felt before. It was a glorious resurrection, from the tomb of slavery to the heaven of freedom. My long-crushed spirit rose, cowardice departed, bold defiance took its place, and I now resolved that, however long I might remain a slave in form, the day had passed forever when I could be a slave in fact. I did not hesitate to let it be known of me that the white man who expected to succeed in whipping must also succeed in killing me." This formulation, by the way, "you're gonna have to kill me," right, courses through Black language and letters. Right? There's a line from Mobb Deep where, Prodigy, where he says, anyway, "Since a little dude eat niggas food, $1.50. He's a small dude, right? Niggas could kill me, but they come and whip me, right? This idea that I may not win, but you're not. If I lose, you'll have to kill me. Is an old formulation. It's worth talking about maybe in Q&A. So the moment for in Douglass's narrative is one of a series in which Douglass takes affirmative steps towards freeing himself. And it's predicated on a moral order that he claims to defend his body in order to lay claim to its integrity. But the chiasmus also has some ambiguity. So of course Douglass was made a slave and then a man. Right? You've seen how a man was made a slave and how a slave was made a man. But so was Covey. And what I mean by that is, in the 19th century, the use of slavery as a metaphor for psychological attachment and for the condition of being economically vulnerable as applied to white people was in circulation. Right? So we can imagine that he saw how Covey was bound to, right, a particular ideology, attached to it. Right? He even refers to Covey in a text on several occasions as an addict. And he talks about an addiction to constant surveillance of the enslaved people. Douglass said, Covey would be out with us. The way he used to stand it was this. He would spend most of the afternoon in bed. He would then come out fresh in the evening, ready to urge us on with his words of example and frequently with the whip. Mr. Covey was one of the few slaveholders who could and did work with his hands. He was a hard-working man. He knew by himself just what a man or boy could do. There was no deceiving him. His work went on in his absence almost as well as in his presence, and he had the faculty of making us feel that he was ever present with us, that he did by surprising us. Right? It's kind of like the mask, right, or Foucauldian, the way he describes the surveillance. But it's one that binds Covey as well, right? For Douglass, like Walker, the idea of emancipation was not simply one that was attached to a notion of bringing black people into citizenship, but was something great about reconstituting ideas of right and wrong and belonging, right? And when he defeats Covey, right, it is a sign that he is, after all, nothing but a man, another vernacular phrase. And he says that. Now, also, his name, which is a pseudonym, it's not incidental, right? And he describes, his name is Covey, like cover, but he also literally describes him as living under a cover. He uses the word cover, a dark shelter, in the form of religion under which the slave society found protection, right? And one thing that's really interesting about this to me is that the use of cover for Douglass is an important precursor to Du Bois's notion of the veil in his account of Jim Crow. So while the veil is this kind of thin membrane of the color line, the cover that Douglass identifies as a fictional account of its legitimacy, okay? And in the form of a particular brand of religion. Okay, I'll stop there, but we could go back to talk more about Douglass later. So long after emancipation, the insights of these early thinkers coursed through black letters. So take, for example, George Jackson's prison letters and Soledad Brother. In one of them he writes, in the midst of the Black Power movement, in one of them he writes, "The logical place to begin any investigation into the problems of California prisons is with our pigs, our beautiful Governor Reagan, radical reformer turned reactionaries." Reagan, I don't know if he was a radical reformer, but Reagan was liberal. "For a real understanding of the failure of prison policies, it is senseless to continue to study the criminal. All of those who can afford to be honest know that the real victim, the poor, the uneducated, disorganized man who finds himself a convicted criminal, is simply the end result of a long chain of corruption and mismanagement that starts with people like Reagan." Interesting that that's the decade you see the massive increase in mass incarceration. This is actually like a decade prior to Reagan's presidency, right? "You must begin with directors, assistant directors, adult authority boards, roving boards, supervisors, wardens, captains, and guards," right? Now, rereading this for me, I immediately think of the posthumous hagiography of Reagan that has turned him into a saint instead of a divisive political leader at best, right? And the current narrative cleansing of the then unpopular George W. Bush, and how indeed those are gestures in the long game of mischaracterizing the problem. So there are no consequences, only honor and remembrance of power, as though it's off limits to question the very nature of the authority granted and for what ends, right? So what George Jackson is doing is he doesn't identify the incarcerated as antisocial, or in the words of West Side Story, depraved on account of their deprived, right? Rather, the problem is that the society created the criminal, like it had created slaves. Right? So the first half of the chiasm is how a person is made a slave, a convict, and illegal, right? It persists, a sign of the failure of the state vis-a-vis its others, right? So I reread this book after recently participating in a wonderful conference at Harvard on prisoners and prisons, and one of the words that was used often, and that is used so often, was re-entry, right, for people who have been incarcerated. And it's one of those terms that, like Jackson talks about, and I would argue in the tradition of Walker and Douglass and others, that obscures, that covers, that acts as a dark shelter, right? When in fact the gates of the society remain locked against the ex-felon, right, and often locked beforehand. So hence the question is not in fact whether they are equipped to walk back in, which tends to be the language, the frame discussions around incarceration, but whether the path is barred, right? One more pun. So Black's Law Dictionary was first written by Henry Campbell Black in 1890. It was revised several times, but very early on it became, and it remains, the primary reference document for terms in legal briefs and court opinions, and it's often cited as a secondary authority in cases, etc. And it provides it's really a dictionary, right? Definitions of terms we use throughout the law. Some terms fall out of favor and some come back in, right? The first edition, unsurprisingly, Negro and slave were amongst the words defined. Pauli Murray, who's one of the most important thinkers in the history of American law, was born a black woman into a very accomplished family in the year of the second edition of Black's Law Dictionary, 1910, and lived, like other black Americans, under the thumb of the color line, notwithstanding her incredible achievement. Now, Murray's life has been of great interest for years. She was a lawyer, she was a scholar, a poet, a nonfiction writer, a minister, a queer person who wrote about her struggles regarding her feelings that her gender assignment might not have been right really long before we had discussions about gender assignment and gender identity in the United States. But Pauli Murray, the point here is that she wrote a reference document as well, but it was titled States' Laws on Race and Color. And that became known as the Bible of Civil Rights Lawyering. It was first published in 1950. And it was a painstakingly created volume which cited legislation from 48 states and the District of Columbia and ordinances of 24 major cities across the country regarding race. There's never anything close to this. It really is the document that founds the field of race in the law. And in the complete text of every single ordinance was included, in addition to occasional notes, almost a kind of bibliographic essay form in the midst of all these citations. Now, Murray's reference text, though different from Black's Law Dictionary in that it wasn't a dictionary, it was still definitional. It was a documentary of the racial regime as elaborated in American law, undertaken with the goal of dismantling it, right? As opposed to being a source, the document as an authority, it was a document that was revealing this kind of fundamental failure of the institution. It was an account of what is that in its very structure argued a different idea of what ought to be, right? Now, in retrospect, of course, because Murray's work was so important for actually contesting many of these laws in civil rights lawyering, and all the NAACP lawyers used it, we tend to focus on the functionality of the document, but I think it also is one of the many textual examples of a tradition of legal philosophy and Black thought, right? Literally attempting to escape the constraints of an order that marginalizes and oppresses, right? And escape, we have then the kind of refrain about fugitivity yet again. As a figure, the fugitive at once runs and hides out, right? And I think that, for me, that leads then to another branch of this jurisprudential tradition that I want to point to before bringing some of the thoughts up to the present moment. As a companion to Douglas's narrative, when we teach African American literature, often Introduction to African American Studies, we often assign Harriet Jacobs' incidents in the life of a slave girl as a kind of a woman's companion in terms of a foundational text in Black letters. And I also would argue that it sets forth related ideas in the history of African American jurisprudence, right? So for Jacobs, who as an effort to protect herself from the institutionalized rape that enslaved women were routinely subjected to, she recounts living for 7 years in what's referred to as she refers to as the loophole of retreat, hidden in an attic on the same plantation where she was enslaved. She deceived her master into thinking she'd escaped to Massachusetts long before she actually did. It kind of circumvents the fugitive slave law, as it were, right? Now, as many critics have noted, while Douglas's narrative set forth a tradition of freedom being associated with mobility, or free movement, right? In Black letters, Jacobs does the same for an association between freedom and domesticity, right? This sort of struggle over the home. But the loophole of retreat suggests something more about being placeless inside, right? Of a form of statelessness, which is characteristic of an existence of no refuge, just invisibility, and that's actually part of what makes Toni Morrison's Beloved such an important and shattering novel, right? And it's a narration of the substance of the Dred Scott opinion, which said, there's no Black people are citizens, right? And there are no rights which a black man is bound, a white man is bound to respect that are possessed by black people. And so in the novel, Coming to Freedom, right, running to freedom did not mean coming to freedom. And so this question of statelessness, of course, persists, or as at least a question mark, right? So when I think of Harriet Jacobs, I actually often think of the story of Aiyana Stanley, a 7-year-old girl black girl from the east side of Detroit, who was shot and killed during a raid conducted by the police department in 2010. Her death drew national attention. Representative John Conyers asked Eric Holder, who was then the Attorney General, for a federal investigation into the incident. There was not one. There were a series of trials, however, and as is the norm, the killer of this child was not convicted of a crime. And the penetration of the locked door of their apartment for the sake of capturing and killing entailed, of course, an argument, a justification, right? And I read the argument and the way that the argument, and also the same substance, the powerful criticism is actually too weak a word, damnation of the incident, is not really simply about the zealousness or overzealousness of policing or the appropriate use of force, but about being without sanctuary. There's nowhere to go, right? Likewise, in the recent spate of cases of black women who are found guilty of basic deeds, right? So the homeless woman who was jailed for sending her child to a school out of district, a conviction literally for stealing education, one idea that conceptually bears a great likeness to the sense that thieving knowledge reduced the value of the enslaved, hence its prohibition, right? And by that I mean the protection of districts in this fashion is, of course, a protection of the racial stratification in education matched with the police power, right? Or we could take the case of a woman recently incarcerated for exercising the right to vote that had been taken from her because of a felony conviction, right? And we ought to keep in mind then what George Jackson's conception of what that really meant was, right? We see an echo in her incarceration of the punitive, violent responses to black people seeking to exercise suffrage rights in Jim Crow, and also an echo of the way in which the society creates the criminal rather than the other way around, right? So asking the question, as you know, happens oftentimes in media coverage with these kinds of events, about the eligibility of someone to vote, is the wrong question according to the tradition that I'm identifying. Right? It isn't about whether the person is eligible, but what order is being created by establishing ineligibility. So the most basic level, what I offer these few examples to show is that, one, African American literary jurisprudence should not be simply understood as being about black people existing in a state of exception vis-a-vis the project of US democracy, right, as some strange outliers who are simply making claims about against their exclusion, but rather that the tradition challenges the construction of US law at its foundation, as a means of interrogating the very social construct that it scaffolds. A few more thoughts about related thoughts, right? So it's common to hear on the news these days about working class white male resentment or anxiety that is expressed in a resurgence of white nationalism. And the response to last week's Blue Wave has been to share photos of the diversity of the new representatives. Oftentimes, and you see it on social media, when people say, "This is my America," right? This is democracy. And what I think is lost in some of this discussion, although I'm touched by the hopefulness, is that those resentful white, cis, straight men who fear they have lost something are in fact reeling and raging due to a broken promise to them. Right? The promise of domination. Okay? And at every turn, when it's promised to those men, we see, it's evidenced in the distribution of suffering, of punishment, of reward and benefit, right? But the swath of people who get that advantage is narrowing, right? The wages of whiteness, to borrow from Du Bois, have become less reliable because of the concentration of wealth. So that produces a sense of betrayal over this promise. And we can contrast that promise to the one, for example, that Martin Luther King Jr. identified when he talked about the promissory note that the nation had failed to make good on, as written into the second founding of the Constitution with the Reconstruction Amendments, right? So the I Have a Dream speech is really the broken promise speech. The bulk of the speech is about the failed promissory note to Black America, right? And indeed, what's clear is that the country, at least after the second founding, has been talking out of both sides of its mouth. Right? The operations of justice are irreconcilable. You cannot make good on both promises made to whiteness and promises for liberty and justice. Right? And this is what rips through the histrionics in response to athletes kneeling at the Star-Spangled Banner. Right? It's not merely a conflict over patriotism. It is about what kind, which promise. Right? And I would argue that this points to an essential tension. Right, so often we wind up talking about discussing a distinct but related tension. Before I get to that, I'll say when people on one side look at the current disastrous state of affairs and they say this isn't my country, and then others say it most certainly is, right? It's always been your country, right? And that's an argument over the virtues and failures of the U.S. But this tension is a tension between the one who looks at all of these different colored and bodied people getting ever so precarious and minimal access, as saying, this is not my country, right? And those who are saying, this little bit is actually not what my country promised me. Right? It's a kind of mutual dissatisfaction. So the implications for us are some choices have to be made about what justice would require. From the very founding of the nation, from Madison's words in Federalist 54, we have seen how economic interest and a political order in which representation was overdetermined by wealth, we see that still, right? How that was woven into the fabric of the society in such a way that it is not surprising that the same problematic exists today. Right? And I mean that in the case of virulent voter suppression, I mean that in the case of a set of immigration policies that both facilitate the exploitation of labor and the denial of rights of the undocumented, et cetera, et cetera. Right? So we have to make some decisions. This is in the fabric, right? And so I think the critique that the tradition lodges actually poses that challenge to us. Now, when I taught law school, I often felt compelled to make recommendations that were practical, and I thankfully don't feel that burden anymore. But I do think that we have a responsibility to often to sort of try to think about what are takeaways when we share some ideas, at the very least for the sake of engagement, even if ultimately what we come to isn't yet satisfying, right? So I'll say this, having spent years in various ways examining this tradition and seeing the questions and challenges that they pose have sustained meaning even after many decades of struggle and social upheaval and transformation. At the very least, I think it's a recommendation that we turn a critical gaze towards the instrumentalism of the ideology of white supremacy. And that requires us to never be content with the logic of reforming profoundly unequal institutions, social arrangements, right? Reform is at best a stopgap, right? The battle must be waged at the level of design and with resistance to the perceived boundaries of membership. One of my favorite quotes is Ida B. Wells' formulation that people must know before they can act. And in that tradition of thought, we see the example of how Tuskegee became a site for extensive research on lynching as part of the struggle against lynching, or Howard as the grounds for the development of the strategy to dismantle Brown v. Board of Education, or the citizenship schools and the work of Septima Clark in particular in the context of the civil rights movement. And that is to say, a liberatory epistemology is central to movement and essential to justice. And so all of that really to say that I think that even without a recommendation yet for what a different constitution would be, we have the kind of tradition that should help us think, not just in fresh ways, but in important ways about the question of justice itself. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Hey, you're not done.
Oh.
I hope you're willing to take some.
I would love to take questions. Challenges.
Is it okay if you take your question?
Yes. No, I can do it.
Thank you very much.
Yes.
Yeah, you mentioned the white male and his concern about sort of being squeezed, let's say. But when we look at white supremacy and white privilege, it generally has a white male face and rarely a white female face. And I'm thinking of instances in the news more recently where white women have taken it upon themselves to, say, govern black behavior.
Yes.
A white woman calling the police because there are two white children in a car being driven by a black man who is their babysitter.
Right.
And she thinks there's something wrong with this. But I can give you a number of examples.
Yes, absolutely.
Where white women are now in the news policing black behavior. What does that come from? I mean, we
Well, it's
understand-
old. I mean, I don't think it's new.
No? Okay.
Yeah. You know, so I think of the case of, so one of the cases I wrote about, let me say a couple of things. One of the cases that I wrote about was 1831 case in North Carolina, State v. Mann, in which someone has rented out this black woman named Lydia who's enslaved, and in the process of punishing her, he disables her physically. She can't do much more work. And so her owner sues the person who she rented for damage to her property. Right? And the owner is a woman. Right? And for me, I talk about her example, I talk about the example of Queen Elizabeth, talk about that there's actually, for me, it's twofold, right? So there have been white women as agents of white supremacy, but also as participants in the logic of patriarchy. So I read patriarchy as actually an institution that emerges in the context of both the emergence of a kind of global capital order and modernity, and that it's constituted like precisely when there's the development of the transatlantic slave trade and the expansion and this beginning stages of colonization. And so, and the way the patriarch is created is that, he has property, he has legal personhood standing, so he's recognized before the law as a citizen, and sovereignty. And that sovereignty is not simply having rights in whatever nation, whatever European nation, it's also a sovereignty that it invests in the domination of others. And that patriarch conventionally has a figure who is or figures who are lieges, like, wives or other women who are attached who don't have the same sort of full access to patriarchy, but have some form of its benefits. But there are also some instances in which women did occupy that position, and I think that category has expanded, right? So some of those sort of benefits of status do extend beyond those to whom it conventionally applied. So you have this weird situation. So you do have, this spate of examples where sort of white women are engaged in the policing of black people. But it's also, if you think about institutional structures, the ways in which, for example, that black people come into contact with the criminal justice system, right? Many of those authority figures are white women as well, social workers, teachers, who are the point of first contact. So I think that there is while there is, that doesn't discount sort of gender inequality that exists within whiteness, I do think we sort of think about the structure of domination on the part of the West over everybody. It has always included this sort of intermediate position, oftentimes, possessed by white women. And part of my critique, actually, of like sort of modern feminism is that so often the discussions, like sort of lean-in feminism, are about sort of what is the distribution of power of domination over other people between, you know, the lord and the lady, not sort of a deeper consideration of what gender justice would look like, right? So how do you, so these are sort of conflicts at the top that don't actually get to the kind of what it means to work in a sweatshop, for example. So I do think, yes, absolutely, and I think it has old roots, and it's just that it's expanded more as a sign of the kind of perversion of the narrow frame of the feminist movement, a mainstream feminist movement. Anyway, that's a lot. I promise I won't take so long. You can ask another question. Yes, please.
I hesitate because I'm trying to figure out how to formulate this question. This question is more looking internally into the Black community,
Yeah.
but I suppose it can expand a little bit to the question I was asked previously, but within a social group, there is this kind of need to rise up on a ladder, and the way it's structured is the only way for you to succeed is by hurting or leaving behind those who maybe share the same identity as yourself. So from the question before, it was more like women against other women to get to the top. So the question I want to ask is, this kind of structure still exists among minority communities, and I guess we'll just go straight to the Black community. So there's a lot of like, I want to ask like, how you've experienced this, and how do you see that it's going forward? Because a lot of conversation is about these external things against the Black community, but the Black community itself has so many issues among itself. And I think I went to a talk where someone was referring to so many, the progress that was made with so many Black people making it onto the high courts, and you see some of the same stereotypes and the same people, like lawyers, perpetuating some of the same issues that Black people have been fighting against. And someone had mentioned like there's this issue of like internal slavery, like you can't break out of those boundaries. So I'm just wondering how exactly that, like there's so many years that we've been fighting some of this external fight, but you're so distracted that you don't have time to heal that internal fight amongst each other. Like the only way to succeed is by hurting the other person. And when you're succeeding, the only way for you to stay on top is by perpetuating.
Yeah, so I mean, it's a complicated question to answer, so I'm going to answer in a couple of different ways because I think this is really important. So there's a vernacular way of responding to it, which is the expression all skin folk and kill folk, right? That, you know, at no point has there been a way of necessarily, at no point has it been the case that an assumption of racial solidarity can be made simply by virtue of being ascribed to a particular group, right? But then there's another piece that I think that you're referencing that is a particularly kind of pernicious consequence of desegregation, which is that institutional structures, and as part of what I write about is Black associational life that existed in the context of the United States, sort of pre-Jim Crow, very robust associational life where people literally participated in numerous organizations, the fabric of community, and Black teachers associations, business associations, virtually every kind of civic form of engagement had networks that were both local and national, and at times international, right? So you go from this landscape where there is what Du Bois talked about as life behind the veil. There's this kind of, there's this oppressive racial regime, domestic and global, right? But underneath that, there is the creation of a very kind of robust network of Black life and institutions. in the concept of desegregation, you know, much of that falls apart because access begins to expand, but also some of them are just structurally destroyed. So for example, right, and something on the order of, I mean, over 75% of black principals lost their jobs after desegregation because the idea wasn't really to integrate white kids into black schools, right? Because this idea of being under the authority of black educators was not seen as acceptable. So it happened the other direction at the same time as there's massive white flight to the suburbs or to private schools, right? So the schools ultimately wind up not integrated, but also no longer under black control, and you have entire black professional classes that are now unemployed or dispossessed, and not just principals and teachers, but like athletic directors and band leaders. I mean, there's just a whole network, right? So it's just one example, and there's sort of different manifestations of that in different professions. And part of what happens on top of that is that when the doors are opened in the society, they're open in a very narrow way, right? So if you think about, for example, what it means now, that there are no longer sort of any serious efforts in U.S. law to deal with the, at the federal level, right? There's some state efforts, but the massive inequality of education at any level. The only sort of remedial measure that is upheld by the court is currently higher education, is affirmative action and higher education admissions at very elite institutions that can actually look at the whole, you know, has enough resources to pretend as though they're not really thinking about race too much, but looking at the whole group of people. So the bottleneck, right, there's not a kind of equalization effort across the board, there's a bottleneck which puts that small number of people in a very different kind of social location, not in a different wealth location, because wealth inequality persists irrespective of how much education black people get. But that then the position, in many ways, not only is it sort of, it fractures the idea of mutual aid, because there are very few people who make it through, but then the frame of reference is not the kind of collective community, or, I mean, just there are efforts to do that at various institutions, right? Like you have, you know, National Society of Black Engineers, to sort of keep these things intact, but it's a structure of both pulling people out and not distributing opportunity to any more than a very few. And it's a deeply competitive model. So I think the challenge you pose is really about how do we become creative about thinking in a very different context than the one 50 years ago, about how you build a notion of black politics that it really is about thinking about the condition of black people writ large. And I think that that is also a question that needs to be revived, not just domestically, but internationally. I won't go into too much more detail because that's a long answer, but I mean, another piece of that is that for the major civil rights organizations in the late 40s and early 1950s, there was a very deliberate pressure on the part of the US government to, in exchange for beginning to take some positions in support of civil rights, pressure on African American civil rights organizations to detach themselves from black international politics. And kind of a deal was struck to kind of disengage. And so, again, that narrows the scope of the political imagination. So it really is a question of like, of how to rebuild after so much has changed. And I think at the very minimum, one of the things that it requires is that we cannot think individually, right? Because that's not how, politics are not individual matters, but oftentimes that's what you said, right? So people, I often have students who say, I don't know how I'm going to give back, right? But even if you do, and you can do very good work one-on-one, but that's not the same thing as sort of being engaged in a political movement, or like a sort of trying to be engaged in a protracted struggle for social transformation. And those type of struggles not only require groups of people, but they require long periods of time. So if you look at the struggle to dismantle Brown Board of Education, talking about a 20-year legal strategy, right? Like, you know, now people want to start a program and leave it after 3 years, right? And I started this tutoring program, I'm not interested in that anymore, right? I mean, you know, so it does require, I think, Fortunately, we have the models, but they just have to be reimagined for the present. Thank you for that question. Yes.
Yes, I wanted to return this vernacular idea of, you don't have to kill me, like that Black formulation. Because I really, I relate everything back to sort of literature, theater, in some capacity. And I was thinking, as you were saying that, I was thinking of Mario Tradition and Josh Green, willing to die,
Yes.
for his freedom. And this sort of, and also like more contemporarily, Wesley Lowery, who was a journalist at Washington Post, who wrote this book called They Can't Kill Us All. So there's this idea of, like, you're going to have to kill me, but you can't kill all of us.
Right.
And I'm wondering about this tension between sort of liberty and death, even thinking of like Patrick Henry, who's like not, Black, but like, part of the founding of the nation state, and this whole sort of tension between liberty and death in the Black radical tradition. And I also want to know the title of that Mobb Deep song, because I was looking for it, I couldn't find it.
Oh, no.
Yeah.
It's the remix of Quiet Storm.
Okay, great.
Yeah, I mean, it's also Fanonian, right? I mean, this idea that there's some that actually being willing, and I think that's, part of why I started the Lorraine Hansberry quote, this idea of a notion of liberty that is worth dying for, but that it is also, I think, important because it is a confrontation with the moral failure of the state as such, right? So it's not just something worth fighting for, but that I actually think of it as a kind of confrontation with the order formulation. It's Fred Hampton, you can kill a revolutionary, you can't kill the revolution. I mean, it courses all the way through. And sometimes in literal ways and sometimes in figurative ones, but I think it's an important concept, particularly given the constant specter of Black death that's part of U.S. racial domination, right? Because it's a reframing of that as well, right? I mean, one of the debates that has happened in the aftermath for decades over, 16th Street, bombing 16th Street Baptist Church is whether to refer to the 4 girls as martyrs or not, right? Sort of, is the frame, soldiers for the movement, or is the frame simply sort of the violent domination of white supremacy? And I think the debate over that frame is not really about the intent of the little girls going to Sunday school, but is about, what the meaning of Black death is actually going to be, right? Or can be. Yes.
I want to pick up right there, actually, on both of these comments, and just have to really ask you this question, in part because of what it means to me.
I can't hear.
You.
I'm sorry.
Okay, yes.
Yes, so first, thanks for your rich and very engaging and revealing talk.
Thank you.
And I think it's so important to be talking and reflecting and thinking with Frederick Douglass in his 200th birthday year.
Yeah.
So there's just so much that I value even about that dimension of the conversation. On this question of the state and its benign neglect of the Black body, abuses, and the question of how to define what happens. So the example that you use is 16th Street. And another one that's really, whose 40th anniversary is upon us now, is the Jonestown tragedy.
Yeah.
Whose 40th anniversary is literally coming up Sunday. And it's so heartbreaking on so many different levels. I read a book years ago by a guy named Jake Beeson entitled Why We Lose, and that's really why I bought the book, because I found the title to be so provocative. But there's a section in there in which he really reflects on the tendency within the media to refer to that tragedy as a mass suicide, as opposed to a mass murder.
Yeah.
And so it brings up that whole question of, how photographer. And then I think one of the reasons that this grips me so too is that, those were my peers.
Mm-hmm.
They were yours. And
Oh yeah, and remember it, yeah.
Yes, yes. And that over 900 people died there. A third of them were children. And that the state, that the tragedy reflected a failure of state at so many different levels, including just a lack of understanding of how lethal Jim Jones was as a figure, and sending in inadequate support. But then there's also just the horror of the state's way of, misrepresenting what happened and forgetting over time. So many issues are entailed in that. And the twisting of even, I've heard him invoke that notion of revolutionary suicide.
Yeah.
Which was so this was part of the Black radical tradition.
Mm-hmm.
But, the whole tragedy represented really a collapse or appropriation of that rhetoric and turning it around. So.
Absolutely, and just two quick things. I think it's a great, such a useful example. Thank you. And just in terms of coming of age, I do think of sort of those early years as being defined in part for me by watching Roots and Jonestown. Right? These two, really, and back then, you watch that stuff even though you were, a small child, right? And that sort of is kind of one of the initial witnessing of the logic and history of race in the United States as a child. But it's, just to piggyback on that point, years ago I wrote a piece with a law professor at Northwestern, Len Rabinowitz, called Crimes Without Punishment. And what the purpose of the piece was to look at, when people tell the history of housing discrimination, right, they talk about racially restrictive covenants and how they kept people out, and then how persistent. They talk about white flight, and they talk in the Fair Housing Act, right, as the remedy, right? First, Shelley v. Kramer, which says racial covenants are not enforceable. You can't make a little agreement to keep black people out, and then later, actually, sort of legislation is supposed to respond to that. But what isn't talked about is the history of thousands upon thousands of criminal acts engaged in against black people who moved into neighborhoods that were designated for white. So property that's destroyed, physical violence, death, all these things, it's not talked about as a history of crime, right? And that was the point of that. And so given, and that frame also means that the remedy is actually never really a remedy for all of those thousands of people whose property was destroyed, whose lives were destroyed, right? It's that now we're going to try to keep people from discriminating as much moving forward. And so it's another example of really the paradigm that I think we often get caught in part because of the terms on which, that are most easily available to fight, but that I think is really important to resist, right? To tell actually a story that's closer to true. Yeah, thank you.
I need you to go back. Excuse me. It was a wonderful talk, but I realized about 3/4 through that I had not gotten your title. You said passing.
Yes.
It was a pun. I didn't know Blackletter. I'm not in law, and so I didn't. So it was 3/4 through the talk that I finally was making more connections. So would you just tell this layperson what Blackletter is?
So Blackletter. So the pun is that so Blackletter. Law meaning that which is established, like it's a term of art for lawyers, right? That's things that we don't debate on, things that are established. And then part of that, I would argue, is that we have a history of law operating to disadvantage black people, right? So what I'm trying to think about, though, is the way black letters, in the sense of black writing, has challenged that notion, is kind of trying to disrupt the black letter of American law. But it's it's that, and it's like the Black's Law Dictionary. It's interesting to me, this is the black robes, it's a lot of black stuff in law, and so you know, I do think it's a pun, but I also do think that, in part because for so long, and this is what the part that sort of comes out of my dissertation many moons ago, you know, which focused on the late 19th century, you know, black people had very minimal access to the law as a source, as a location for argument. There's some really important cases, but relatively minimal access. So it's actually in literature that I see some of the most robust discussions, ideas about law emerging in Black thought, because you don't have a lot of lawyers until, you know, several generations later. And so, you know, so I'm interested in how are those who are held outside of citizenship making sense of what, not just what the law is, but what it ought to be. Yeah, so.
I'm reading the new biography of Frederick Douglass by
Yes.
Blight.
Yes.
And so I'm hearing a lot of that in, I'm seeing now how much he was a student of the Constitution.
Yes, serious student, and that that there's something very, I know we have to go. I just want to say that one of the things that I like, and I'm not finished with it, but that you know, Blight really spends a lot of time on he keeps writing himself, right? Like, I mean, one of the phenomena, I'm really interested with this Gordon Parks too, but there's some figures who write their memoirs and biographies over and over again. Like, there's an effort to constitute himself, right? And that's part as citizen, right? That's part of the argument. And he grapples with all these ways of doing that, and ways of doing that that are not just about him, but that are about reimagining the very category of citizen. And there's a point towards it's about 2/3 of the way through, where he goes back to his master's son, I think it's his son or nephew, and asks, you know, he's an old man by then, if he has any idea when he was born, right? And this is such a poignant point, right? Because here he is, like, one of the most important thinkers of the 19th century, most photographed man of the 19th century, just kind of incredible intellect, prolific, and that absence, right, even is tugging at him as part of this question of defining himself, right, and in the wake of having been enslaved. So, yeah, I mean, I do the stuff about the Constitution, and what I'm grappling with is how much to read Douglass as adherent to the Constitution, or really a radical reinterpreter of the Constitution. I mean, he is obviously the latter, but, like, you know, I'm still working through to what extent he's just like, we can just lop off these parts, or he's actually really imagining something altogether different. Anyway, thank you for that question.
This is one of the parts of my functions that I really don't like, you know, to be the one to stop a good conversation, you know. I hope you forgive me for that. So before we proceed to the reception, I am happy to report that we do have Mr. Monday and Mrs. Monday here with us. So please welcome them. As I said to the audience in your absence, if you had not been Ithacans, I would have been moved to apologize profusely to you for what we did to you today. But I'm sure that, you know, it's part of the cause for all of us who call this home at some time or the other. But what I said in your absence that I would like to say again is how grateful we continue to be for the generosity that has made this possible, and to let you know, as today's lecture is just part of the evidence, how much this gift keeps giving, both to us as teachers and to the students that we serve, and to the larger Ithaca community, some of whom are represented right here. So thank you so very much on behalf of the department. I would like to thank you, Professor Perry, for a very, very insightful lecture. And I hope that some of my students who are here were able to go along with you as you spoke in terms of some of the things we've talked about, in class. And I'm glad that they see that, somebody can actually lay all this out in a much clearer fashion that their teacher can ever pretend to do. So thank you for that. And to our former faculty who are here, both directors and non-directors, whom Professor Richardson thanked at the beginning, I want to thank you all again, for gracing us with your presence. It's always a reaffirmation for those of us who have inherited this responsibility. When you come back, there's a way that you're telling us we're not sticking up the joint too much. And we're going to keep trying, not to stick it up at all when we can. So thank you all for coming, and we look forward to having you around for many more months to come.